Hi. So with this class, we have lost Alexander the Great. He's died. He was at a very young age, at the age of 33, he died. But of course, in his lifetime, he conquered and occupied more land for the Empire of Greece than any known leader to that day. And in the course of that, and we talked about this, in the course of that, he brought Hellenism, the Greek thought, the Greek culture, the Greek philosophies into the world, throughout the world. And that will include the Jewish population. We know that from later in the New Testament, meeting the Hellenist Jews, the ones who spoke Greek, the ones who thought Greek with Greek thoughts and philosophies. And it will be both a problem, but also in many ways probably beneficial for the Jews later, as we understand the kingdom was never going to be about a physical again. But so we'll move forward, and we've lost Alexander the Great. He died. As you recall, Cassandra, excuse me, he will be the next leader of Macedonia. Kills his only heir at a very young age, infancy, toddler age. And the kingdom, since there's no logical successor to this massive and expansive Greek empire, it will be divided among 5 rulers. The 5 rulers really culturally belong where they rule, and they become those houses that represent those particular places. Antagonist would be the one, if you look at the top map on the slide, it's depicted in green. It's the land that holds Jerusalem, holds the Palestinian area where the few among many Jews have come back. It's the ones that we've left there after the Old Testament. Those Jews who have come back to Jerusalem have reestablished Jerusalem. And so he will be the one for just a few years that will occupy the rulership of that land. Cassandra was up in Macedonia, as you can see in yellow, Thrace. But the 3 that really play into the Jewish history are Ptolemy, who is Egyptian, and you've probably heard of the Ptolemy empires. The Seleucids, which was Syria, depicted in the top map is orange. So you've got the orange, the green, and the purple really coming into play. Lands, the ones that are depicted in those colors on that top map, coming into play for the Jewish history that will affect and impact who the people are once Jesus is born and we open up the gospel messages. You can see the vastness of the Greek Empire, and all that means to us, and our study in particular, is that Hellenism, the ideas, the language, and the thought is gone across the world. Now, what that will do is it will help convert the Gentile world. And so we'll see that in the book of Acts. As you begin to understand in the book of Acts, as Paul makes his travels, the further out from, as Jesus says, he promises the power will come to you and you will teach this in Jerusalem, and then in Judea, and then in Samaria, and then throughout the whole world. That Hellenism and the Greek language and the Greek written language and the Septuagint will come into play. And we'll talk about all of that in this class, but that's why this is important to this particular study. So back in 332 BC, as Alexander the Great, of course, from Macedonia, a Greek, considered himself a Greek, was taking that Phoenician land up in Tyre and coming down and to take Egypt. He, on his way, he takes Jerusalem, and he captures Jerusalem, and it falls under Grecian rule. Now, history records the relationship of this rule as very cordial and pleasant. There's even a historian that records that Alexander had heard of the Jews. He knew of the Jews. He was interested in the Jews. Remember, he had historians along with him. He had people who were accounting everything and recording everything. And this historian records that he actually comes into the temple and, under the direction of the high priest, offers a sacrifice. And so he comes into Jerusalem. It's about 332 BC. And after his death, Jerusalem will become, at this point, a major point of interest for the Ptolemies and the Seleucids as they struggle for this land, which falls between their 2 rulerships. So if you look at the maps on the screen now, you see we've got the map at the bottom is still that map that we had looked at before. We're talking about this land that's encircled there, the Palestinian land, the promised land, which was no longer, of course, the promised land. It was no longer promised to the Jews in the same way. But in 1315, in 315, Ptolemy, Cassandra, Lysimachus, and they formed this alliance. He was from Thrace, Lysimus was from Thrace, and they formed this alliance because they wanted to keep Antagonus in check. Antagonus, the man, the ruler who ruled at that time the Palestinian area, the land in green on the map, he sort of saw himself, or he had aspirations to be the next Alexander. And so obviously these rulers, especially the Seleucids and the Egyptians who were surrounded, who sort of had him wedged in there in the middle, they were concerned about his efforts and his ambitions. So Seleucus had lost Babylon, but he gains it back again. So that's kind of on that cusp of the green and orange. And he begins to set his sights then on that Palestinian land. Seleucus and Ptolemy team together. They come down, and in the top map, you see in the little blue circle, Gaza, they defeat Antagonus at Gaza. And in that battle, and shortly thereafter, they take many of those, what are considered that middle Syrian, central Syrian area. And the cities within that. The city of Jerusalem was among the cities that was captured. And so that comes into play. I want you to remember that when we leave the Jews in the Old Testament, in Ezra and Nehemiah, in that last recorded history, as they're rebuilding the walls, and they're trying to bring the priesthood back, and Ezra's gone out and he's gotten the priest and the Levites to come back so that they could even operate the temple righteously. That's just a small contingent of the Jews. Never again will the majority of Jews live within that Palestinian area. And Jerusalem will be under besiege over and over and over again in these 400 years, as is true in this case. This is an interesting observation that Josephus makes. This was what began to be known about the people of Jerusalem in particular, but also all the Jews. And we'll see this really come into play later as the Maccabees will try to defend themselves against the Syrians. But Ptolemy captures Jerusalem, and he does so by using the Sabbath day. The children of Israel and the Israelites begin to be known as the people that have this weakness. This is noted by Josephus. It was written by another source who had this observation. The people known as Jews, who inhabit the most strongly fortified of cities, called by the natives Jerusalem, have a custom of abstaining from work every seventh day. On those occasions, they neither bear arms nor take any agricultural operations in hand, nor engage in any other forms of public services, but pray with outstretched hands in the temple until the evening. Consequently, because the inhabitants, instead of protecting their city, preserved in their folly, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, was allowed to enter with his army. The country was thus given over to the cruel master, and the defeat of the practice enjoined by law was exposed. That experience has taught the whole world, except that nation, the lesson not to resort to dreams and traditional fancies about the law until its difficulties are such as to baffle human reason. The rest of the world looked at the Jews and thought, what are you doing? You're clinging to a law that makes you defenseless every seventh day. And this was noted as to how Ptolemy had come in and taken the city. He had just waited until the seventh day when the Jews would not defend themselves. And so Ptolemy takes and captures Jerusalem and besieges it. By the way, he will tear the walls of Jerusalem down again, the walls that Nehemiah built. And so over and over, we see the city under besiege between the testaments before Jesus ever comes along. This is a letter It was written by Arestius to Philocrates, and it states that talking about Ptolemy and how he had taken the city, that he had overthrown the whole Creole Syria and Phoenicia, exploiting his good fortune and prowess. He had transplanted some and made others captive. These are people within Jerusalem as well, all throughout this Phoenician area, this Palestinian, the Samaritan area, reducing all to the subjection by terror. It was on this occasion that he transported 100,000 persons from the country of the Jews to Egypt. Of these, he armed some 30,000 chosen men and settled them in the garrisons in the country. So the reason why I wanted to cover this is now Jerusalem, with the walls destroyed again, is under Egypt, is the Egyptian portion of the Hellenist cities and territory that was taken by Alexander. The walls have been torn up again, and people, it is recorded here, 100,000 people were transported from this Judea, Jerusalem area into Egypt, all throughout the country, particularly in a pocket, they say, southeast of Alexandria, and it will have a major impact on this, the Septuagint. You ever heard people saying, you know, that the Septuagint says, or that the apostles were reading from the Septuagint? In the book of Acts, we see this more and more as Paul begins to preach. More and more quotes are taken from the Septuagint. This is an extremely important part of the spreading of the gospel. And as Ptolemy has now taken the city again in the early 300s and late 200 BCs, he has taken this portion of people back, and now we've got more Hellenists, more Jewish Hellenists in the city of Alexandria. The greatest monument of Alexandria Judaism is without question the translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into the Greek language. Time of the origin is unknown, but there is no question that it was translated by Hellenist Jews for their own sake and use during the years of the Greek rule. Alexandrian Jews wanted their Greek-speaking children, who now are 2-3 generations into Hellenism, to be able to read the scriptures, as the mother tongue Hebrew was foreign to those younger audiences and younger generations. Preservation of the Hebrew sacred text and literature was made available to those of future generations who would speak Greek, which, by the way, by the time Jesus came along, would have been most of the known world. It's very important for us to understand, how did this happen? You know, if we were just to close the book on the Old Testament and start again in the New Testament, we would make the assumption that the walls around Jerusalem are the ones Nehemiah built, and that is not the case. The temple will be completely destroyed and rebuilt by Herod. Well, the Septuagint is an interesting document just in and of itself. It means 70. It's frequently referred to in our New Testament Bibles that have cross-references or references in the sides, cross-references and references in the sides. It's frequently noted as LXX, which is, of course, the Roman numerals for 70, because it is thought that 70 translators were used in order to translate this text. It was completed before 200 BC, so within this next 100 years, and a copy was placed in the Alexandrian library. And of course, we know that there were quotes from Genesis and Exodus in the Greek literature before that date. So it would have been probably translated well before then. During the New Testament times, many of the God-fearers among the Gentiles may have had access to the Septuagint. You know, how did Cornelius know? I'm asked that all the time when you study the book of Acts with somebody. How would he have known? How would the centurion have understood the Jews? How would those who were so gracious and kind and loving to the Jews, who found good favor with the Jews, like Cornelius, or the centurion soldier in Capernaum who builds the synagogue for those Jewish people in Capernaum, and Jesus looks at it and says, I have not seen such great faith even in all of Israel, perhaps had a copy, had a way to understand and know through the Septuagint. They were, though this text gave the Gentile and the Hellenist world, which was so many of the folks throughout the world at that time access. It paved the way, this one text, for the ministry of the Apostle Paul and the others who took that message of Christ to the non-Jews. The biblical preaching in Greek, speaking the word is based, that was speaking, as they were speaking the word, was based on this text. Many of the New Testament quotations, like we said, came from that. And if you see that LXX in your Bible, that's exactly what that means. And so this was very important. It's very important for us to understand that when Jesus, he stayed mostly in the Palestinian area, but he did run and come in contact with Gentiles who seemed to know what the Messiah and the expectation of the Messiah might have been. I'm going to shift us back to Jerusalem now. So we got a really large, in fact, Egypt is an interesting study just in and of itself with the Jews. There was a huge temple, a replica. Of course, we know, have we talked about the one in Gerizim yet? But there was also a big replica of the temple down in the Egyptian area, not quite to Ethiopia, but almost to Ethiopia. And we know that there were many Jews in that area, which thus, when you come to Acts, the 8th chapter, and you meet the Ethiopian eunuch, it doesn't come as any surprise to us that there were those faithful who traveled from that area up into Jerusalem during the days of the feast and the festivals. But so now we've got the Alexandrian Jews there. They're generationally, they're now fathers and mothers and grandparents of children who are not speaking the Hebrew language to the extent in any way that they did when they all lived in Palestine. They're not Aramaic. They're not speaking Aramaic, which is probably what most of the Jews in Palestine would have spoken, but they're speaking Greek. And so now they have this text, which has been translated. It's housed in it will be housed in the Alexandrian Library. But I'm going to shift us back to Jerusalem, because another tragic thing that happens to the Jews during the 400 years between the Testaments is they lose sight of their high priesthood. By the time Caiaphas and Annas and the high priest of the New Testament that we meet come into play, they are appointed by the government. They are no longer high priestly positions appointed due to the hierarchy that God has set into play through the lineage of Aaron and the Levites, but they are high priests who are appointed, and they are political appointees. They are the judges, the great judges of the Supreme Court in Jerusalem really have no right to even be there among the Jews. But we begin to see the shift about 300 BC. During the days when Simon the Just, or Simon the Righteous, who you can see many tables depicting him as a descendant of Aaron, is the high priest in Jerusalem. It's during the Ptolemy period. They have come in and they are now within the city, and they are under Egyptian rule. He was the son of Onias the first, therefore his high priesthood was known to be from the house of Onias. And he's the father of Onias II, who will actually come into play a little bit later on when the other family that kind of jockeys for the high priesthood will come into play. But history records Simon the Just, or Simon the Righteous, is great among his brethren. He brings glory to the people. He's credited with rebuilding the walls that Ptolemy has destroyed as he's come into Jerusalem. He repaired the temple. He directed the excavation of the great reservoir, which will provide fresh water for Jerusalem, even in the times of drought or when they were under siege. And he would teach that the thoughts and his theories were that the world rests on three things: the law, divine service, and charity. He was quite a wonderful man. There was a house who I think probably, although there's no way to really know for sure, but could have been related to the house of Tobiah the Ammonite that we read about in Nehemiah, who gave Nehemiah such grief and conflict while Nehemiah was trying to rebuild Jerusalem. But the house of the high priest of Onias I and the house of Tobias were bitter enemies. They were rivals during these years when Ptolemy had come in and taken over and destroyed the walls of Jerusalem. The house of Tobias was pro-Egyptian. They represented the wealthy class of Jerusalem society. They favored the publican. They were the publican. They collected taxes. They favored the government, so they would have been known like the publicans were in the New Testament. Those who were loyal to the government at this time, being the Egyptians. They were pro-Egyptians, and they were really unkind, and they had no respect for the house of Onias, for the high priesthood. There was no, they were not from the lineage of the priestly line, and they were jealous, and they actually caused a lot, like I said, a lot of grief for the house of Onias and Simon the Just, but particularly Simon the Just's son, who was named Onias II. Now, Onias II, there was a particular tax that was over and above the other taxes, that was a tribute tax that was normally paid by the high priest. Onias felt that this tax was unfair. Ptolemy IV insisted that this tax be collected, and he demanded that Onias pay. And there was some going back and forth about this, and Onias was going to refuse. And he said that the high priest who and the priesthood of Israel was separate and apart, that they were ruled by a different law, and that they did not need to pay tribute to a Gentile and heathen government. So Joseph, who was of the house of Tobias, saw for himself a door that was open, and he succeeds. He goes to Alexandria. He petitions for himself to be the main and chief tax collector throughout the land of Palestine. He became known as the tax farmer for all of Palestine, which means he would go in and he would reap the harvest, and he would collect all the taxes. He was not particularly kind. He did not like the Orthodox and most righteous of the Jews. He would collect all of the taxes, to include the high priestly tax that Onias II refused to pay. And because he was able to do that, and he did that through force, he held that influential post for 20 years under both the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And that this is where we begin to see the shift now. And pretty soon, we're not too far off when the high priesthood will be an appointed position that the government appoints. You realize, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Seleucids, who were the Syrians, the Romans eventually, they don't care about the lineage of the high priesthood. They don't understand righteousness. They don't understand holiness. They don't understand what it means to be a priest, much less a high priest. And so we are going to see this shift and this change. And so what that does for us is when Jesus then stands before the Sanhedrin, and the high priest sits judgment, one who is not even authorized by God to be in the position that he is in, we begin to see the ironies and understand what those depictions mean to us and what they would have meant to Jesus. As over and over and over again, Jesus will point out the flaws and the inadequacies of the political system of the nation of Israel by the day that he arrives. All right. We're going to move a little further next time. Hope you can join us there.